Go.
Great. Welcome back to Senate Education, Thursday, February 2nd. We're going to just spend about 20 minutes talking about pensions, where things stand right now with teacher pensions, educators' pensions, that would also include support staff. And Mr. Fannin, the Executive Director of Vermont NEA, is here to talk about this, as well as, if you don't mind, some follow-up on the letter that you wrote and some of the concerns that you have going forward.
Sure. All right. Thank you. For the record, Jeff Fannin from Vermont NEA. Thank you for having me. Also, for the record, be remiss if I didn't say Hayden is home sick. I understand he shouldn't be working, should be sick and getting well. So get well, Hayden.
Yeah. We'll see you tomorrow. You can stay home as long as you want.
Yes. Do us a favor. Stay home till you're well.
Right.
So I'll start with a bit of history.
Yeah.
I've submitted written documents. I have copies if you need it, but this is not on my written submission. I'm happy to pass out.
No, we don't have it. Okay. You don't have it. Great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I have one more.
Oh, sure.
I'll leave it with
Oh,
my
sure.
colleagues. Package. Thank you.
If you have an extra, we'll put one
We
in
have all of
the
it.
file.
Just less paper for me to take back.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Just a bit of history here. So this plan was established for teachers.
Yeah.
The teacher retirement system, VISTERS. I'll use that name a lot here. VISTERS was established in 1947. It's a state teacher system.
Yep.
Created then, started then. I started Vermont in 21 years ago. The plan was pretty well established then. And in 2010, there were changes made to the plan. And essentially, they were asking teachers to work a little bit longer, pay a little bit more. And at the end of the road, there was a slightly enhanced healthcare benefit in retirement. So work longer, pay more. And at the end of the road, if you met certain benchmarks, you got an enhanced.
What year was that?
2010. So they went from, teachers then went from contributing 3.54% of their salary to 5% in 2010. And then, hang on, I'm getting there.
I want to know, when you say 5%
Of their salary went
into,
into the VISTERS system.
right,
It's not a defined, so these are.
right, it's not a 403B or whatever.
No, it's not a 403B or 401K. It's a defined benefit plan. And what that means is it's a contributory plan. They contribute, teachers do, as do employers and the state. They all three contribute to this system. And at the end, you have a defined benefit based on your years of service, based on your salary, a couple other actuarial factors that go into it. And you get a defined benefit pension until you pass away.
Mm-hmm.
Now you can reserve some of that pension for your spouse. It's called the joint survivor amount.
How much can you,
How much?
percentage wise? We're not going to vote the
You could. There are gradations, and at how much the plan allows.
It's like a corporate model.
Yeah.
The surviving spouse may have about 40%.
I was going to say 60-40, but the system does allow you to take more and get less for your spouse. So there are adjustments and gradations on that. So it's not definite, and you make choices when you retire, and they're irrevocable choices. You can't change them. Oh, I now have contracted some grave illness. I want to change it and reserve more for my spouse when I pass away. You can't do that, and it's a risk for both at that point. You make decisions as you do when you retire, and you have to live with them. And the other two systems that I'll talk about too are VEMRS, Vermont Municipal Employees Retirement System. VEMRS is for the support staff, paraeducators, clerical, administrative folks, anybody who's not a licensed teacher working in a school who works for a school district that elects to participate in VEMRS. VEMRS is not mandatory. VISTERS is. All licensed teachers in the state of Vermont must participate and do participate in VISTERS.
And the district has the keys to that kingdom in terms of,
Well, most often, yes, the answer is yes.
okay,
And a lot of times it happens at the collective bargaining table where you bargain with your employer, the support staff do, and they might say, we want we want our employees to be in the Beamer system. So that would be the
now looking for you to comment, it just strikes me as a problem that, again, this for paraeducators, we know that we have a very educated educator group of people, roughly 50% have bachelor's degrees, which is incredible and great. Seems like we're saying, leaving to certain people, hey, but we're not going to give you this. So it just,
I think I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
And perhaps the posture on which you make that statement. And I don't disagree with it, but I will say that our paraeducators and our support staff are not highly compensated. And so it is too also contributory.
Yeah.
And there are many paraeducators may not want to participate in the retirement system and take something out of their
Sure.
paycheck. So
Sure.
so we're making value judgments all the time
Yeah.
as we do, but it's typically happens at the local bargaining table where we agree, this is what we think we want to do. And lastly, as Senator Hashim knows, there's the state employees retirement system, VISRs, and that too, that covers the state employees,
Yeah.
troopers, and in that regard. So there's that. In the Beamer system, just for quick information, 2/3 of the employees, the beneficiaries or participants in the Beamer system, are school-based employees. So it does include snowplow drivers, municipal workers, clerks, town clerks, and those sorts. But the vast majority, 2/3, are school-based employees. All three boards, VISTers, VISRs, and Beamers, are governed jointly with a board that includes employees, in this case, 2 teachers, a retired teacher, the treasurer, and 2 gubernatorial appointments. And the same for Beamers and VISRs. So they're jointly administered plans, much like they are in the private sector. Taft-Hartley trusts are also equally equally administered plans. So that's how they operate. And the systems make decisions as they will. VPIC, Vermont Pension Investment Commission, makes the investments and decisions about investments for all 3 plans, all of the state's monies. And you might want to check in with the treasurer's office. They might be able to give you some details about the amount. I think it's approaching $10 billion. Maybe I'm off. Maybe it's 8 billion, but there's a lot of money. I think that's a lot of money. I don't know. Being invested by VPIC, and Tom Galanka is the chair of VPIC. He may be somebody you might want to converse with. A quick aside too. This is all jurisdiction of the Senate Government Operations Committee. They deal with this on a more regular basis, but it does come up in education, as you know, and that's why I'm happy to talk with you about it. Some other history, 2014, there were further changes to the VISTers system where teachers paid even more. So they went from 5 to 6% in 2014 for new hires. Anybody who was not yet vested prior to, I think it was July 1 of 2014, and any new hires thereafter also pay 6%. So if you had vested fully by 2014, you stayed at 5%. New hires are at 6%. As well, schools now contribute to a portion of the plan, and that started in 2014. So school districts now contribute some where they did not before.
2 questions. First, in the 2014 shift, were there benefit changes or was it just contribution changes?
I just jotted this note down. The answer has got to be yes, because it's typically thought of as a contract between the state and employees. And so when you change a contract, there's got to be mutual consideration on both sides. I forget the detail of what changed in 2014 for the teachers to satisfy the contract clause issues that might have come up. And I apologize, I can look back.
I was just curious if the educators at the time thought that it was kind of an equitable shift, or if it created a turbulence.
Well, I guess it wasn't a contract claim because it was only for new hires. I apologize.
Right.
So prospectively, we just changed the contract, if you will, be prospectively for new teachers.
Not unusual in that time frame.
Right. I'm going back on memory bank here a little bit, but so there were no benefit enhancements at the time in 2014. It's just an increase to unvested and new hires going forward. So trying to shore up the plan and making sure that it was there well into the future, which is our goal. We want to make sure teachers have a decent retirement as they deserve. So that's what happened in 2014. Then we got to 2021. There were some concerns with the plans, the stability of the plans. In the House and Senate, we passed a bill to study that. There was a pension task force that really dug into the details over starting in July of 2021 and went in, frankly, to January of 2022 beyond their, I think they were supposed to only meet a number of times and end in December, but they kept going because they were getting close and it was tough work, and they did a lot of good work and came forward with a proposal that was enacted last spring. And that changed the rates, as you'll see on page 2, the teacher rate going forward. And so we're in year 1 right now. Year 2 is next year, starting July 1. And then year 3 is supposed to go back to what the parties all thought was necessary, which is a marginal rate. It's sort of like your income tax, based on how much you make, pay based on that, dollar for dollar increments. We went to the banded rates in figures 1 and 2 for administrative purposes in the years 1 and 2 only. It was a little bit easier to administer for schools. Their software systems couldn't go to a marginal rate system. So we all figured this out in the cafeteria last year, as we did, as often is the case, and came up with the banded rates that they could live with, that we could live with in the short term. I know the treasurer has some comments about going back to the marginal rates as agreed to last spring. And you might want to speak with the treasurer about that. And I know that's something that's on his mind. Okay. And we'll figure that out as we will. A couple demographics there on going back to page 1. Teachers are active teachers at 10,387, retirees at 10,295. It just demonstrates it's a more mature plan. It's been around since 1947. Mm-hmm. You'll see VEMR's is a newer plan where you have a lot more active folks than you do retired folks, and that's a less mature plan, is how I would describe it. Sure.
Just curious, active versus inactive teachers, as inactive versus tired. I mean,
so teachers might work for a few years, have some credit in the system, and then teachers are about 77% women, and a lot of them take off time for child rearing, which is great. It does really just reflect, I think, a lot of gender inequality in pension systems, because it's based on years of service. And if one takes off a couple of years to raise a family, it does negatively affect them in their retirement years. And same for Social Security. So I think these are, that's just a demonstration of that, I would say. And then you'll see that the average annual teacher pension is only $22,500, and for VEMR's it's even less, $11,200. So we're not talking about significant pensions here on average. We're talking about people who probably have had to supplement their income in some other ways along the way, and may have a 403B. Some people decide on their own to have a 403B, or work a second job or something like that. So it's.
This is after how many years of?
So the average, I don't know
This is check in based
average year, for years it was 30 years of service. Then it went up to 35 to get the full health benefits. So The retirement office and the treasurer's office probably would have that demographic number for you. I think Colin Robinson may have sent you the valuation from last spring in 2022, I think it was, or the 2022 valuation, and I could pull that up.
That's okay.
But in there, I'm assuming there's a demographic number about the average years of service a teacher, the average teacher in the system has. I don't know what it is offhand. So when we talk about pensions, we're not talking about significant numbers here. And just want to keep that in mind. Other post-employment benefits, OPEBs, healthcare,
OPEBs?
OPEB, other post-employment benefits. It's often referred to as OPEBs. It is typically healthcare in retirement. It's also dental for teachers. It's a one-time option only when a teacher retires. He or she is entitled to elect a dental option. They contribute some towards it. And same for healthcare, although healthcare you can go in and out a little bit. There's reasons for that, and unlike dental. Many teachers do take the healthcare benefit, not all. It's an election on their part. For whatever reason, they may not need it. The spouse may have coverage or something like that. And then, of course, when you get to Medicare, it becomes a Med Sup plan, a Medicare supplement plan. So it just covers the holes, if you will, for Medicare. And that's for Beamers, for the school support staff. It's an incredibly modest monthly stipend for those school employees who are retired who have coverage elsewhere. There is no health care benefit provided by the state. I think it's about a $50 monthly reimbursement arrangement to those folks who have elected on their own to get health coverage elsewhere. And if you've priced out healthcare anytime lately, $50 is not going to go a long way towards covering anything. So that's a rather modest benefit that we'd like to see enhanced. I think it's important to enhance it. And we'll see what goes in that regard. So, and finally, I think it's important for you to note that as I said earlier, it's mandatory for all public school employees, teachers, who are licensed. And it's also, the 4 historic academies also participate. Their licensed teachers also participate in Visters. Their unlicensed teachers do not and cannot. So it's just a licensed system, the Visters system is. And again, the banded rates, you'll see, we're talking about ranges this year from 6 to 6.65. Next year will go up from 6.10 to 7.25. And in theory, the marginal rates will go up all the way to 9% for those making more than $100,000. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Does a teacher invest immediately? I mean, as far as, do they start earning credit at year one and just?
You start earning credit in year one, and it's a 1 year of credit is 175 days of teaching. And then it's a 2-part answer to your question. Teachers vest at 5 years for their pension, but pursuant to the arrangement that was struck in 2010, in order to get the health benefit, you have to work 15 years.
That's okay.
To get 60%. I think 10. I'm sorry, I may be off. It's been more than a decade. I'll have to go back, but it's 60, 70, and then it caps out at 80 at 20 years for the healthcare benefit. So that's.
And does it top out at a period of service like 30, 35 years where the benefits, it's flat, or can they just keep contributing until or is there mandatory retirement? Or
there is a cap out, if you will. There is no mandatory retirement. My father-in-law taught for 37 years, and there is a limit to the multiplier. Of course, your salary typically goes up as you continue to work, and so that helps in that regard. But there is no increase in the multiplier.
please.
Okay,
But, no,
so-
I like this stuff.
Yeah,
I used to do ERISA work. I think it's fun.
So constituents have asked me 50 times in the last 24 hours about something about CPI, a promise.
COLA. Okay.
What?
And the cost of living adjustment, COLA.
COLA.
So starting in 1981, I don't know what was happening then. I was not doing this work. I'll let you know that. Teachers were set and did receive 50% of the cost of living adjustment, or the CPI, Consumer Price Index of the Northeast, CPI-N as it's known. I think it is CPI-N or NE, Consumer Price Index. So for years that went on, and they got 50% of the CPI. That's what they were promised in statute, in documents from the retirement office. Just so you know, Vermont and EA, jointly with the Treasurer's office, the retirement office, puts on retirement sessions for members and teachers to come and learn about their retirement system. It's one of the most productive things we do at Vermont and EA. A lot of people go through it. Everybody, teachers are, they start thinking, as we all do, as you age a little bit, like, oh, what am I going to do in retirement? What is my retirement? And they start coming to these retirement sessions. Those are done with Vermont and EA as well as the Treasurer's office. And we've done those jointly for years, and they go around the state, and they typically after school, there might be some light refreshments and a couple hours of meeting with folks and trying to figure out, help them figure out what they want to do when they grow
Cookies and
up.
punch kind of thing.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
And so it's been a great partnership with the Treasurer's office for many, many years. And in those documents, quite clear that teachers get 50% of the CPI.
Yeah.
In 2016, there was concern over deflation. Teachers get 50% of the CPI up to a cap of 5%. And in the deal that was reached last spring, that cap was lowered to 4%. And the bottom, it used to be 5 and 1, you get no less than 1, and now it's 4 and 0. Those are the new caps and minimum and max. In 2016, concern that the 5 was not at issue, the 1 was at issue, deflation. And so the treasurer came in, then Treasurer Beth Pierce came in and said, hey, we need to protect teachers from a negative CPI, if you will. And so they changed the language to protect teachers from a negative CPI, a negative COLA. And everybody agreed. There was testimony in the House and Senate GovOps. That's what they were designed to do. That's all they were trying to do. There was no discussion whatsoever about an inflationary time, all about deflation. And it was a rather modest conversation. I think Colin, we went back and listened to the tapes, Colin did, and I think he said he clocked it out at 90 seconds of conversation about the teacher system and this issue. So we're not talking about a healthy, robust discussion, but it was clear from the Treasurer's presentation and the Deputy Treasurer's presentation, Michael Clausen, that they were there to protect teachers from a negative CPI. That's all they were trying to do, and everybody agreed. We did agree with that. That's what we wanted to protect. The language was redrafted in 2016, and here we are in a time of inflation. Last year, the CPI, Northeast CPI, was 7.6%. Half of that would be 3.8. We thought, okay, it's 3.8 is under the cap. Retired teachers would get 3.8 cost of living adjustment. The new interpretation that didn't come about until I guess September, October of 2022 was that, wait, the language actually says you only get 50% so long as it's under the cap. So once the CPI exceeds the cap, 7.6 is over 5 or 4 for prospectively for teachers, but let's call it 5 for sake of discussion here today. You lower to the cap and then cut it in half to 2.5, 50% of the cap, if you will. Not how anybody understood it. In fact, it's not how the retirement office's documents in the jointly done retirement sessions reflected anything. And moreover, from 2016 until the most recent valuation in November of 2022, the treasurer's office asked the state's actuary, Siegel, to cost out the COLA using the 50% of the CPI. So when you hear from constituents that talk about this issue, what they're talking about is retired teachers are getting 1.3, I think it is, less than what they were promised and what they thought the law promised them. So that delta for the average teacher at 22,000 is about $300 a year. And then that's just an average, obviously not, I don't think everybody's getting a 22,552, but that's the average we're talking about here. And people, obviously are not happy about that. And I think that it's I've heard discussion about, oh, well, this will add to a cost to the unfunded liability. What I would say is there's no cost at all. There's no cost whatsoever. This was found money, right? The valuations prior to November of 22 all said 50% of CPI. This is money that rightfully, I would submit to you, belongs in the pocket of retired teachers. They had it all along. That's what they were promised. We need to figure this out. And so that's what I think the discussion is all about, and why I think you may be hearing from folks.
Curious if the NEA has articulated this scenario to the members, and if so or if not, any idea what may have triggered this very recent concern about CPI?
We did inform our members recently about it, and that's probably why you're hearing from them. They're, of course, the active folks in the classroom, so it'll affect them. If it's not fixed, the mistake, it really is a mistake, I would submit to you. If that mistake is not fixed, active teachers who eventually retire will get 50% of something less than what they thought they were going to get, just to put it bluntly. So I don't know, depending on what the CPI is and all that fun stuff. But there's a lot of words in the statute that are now being interpreted to mean that the cap essentially is 2.5 or 2.0 for future retirees. I think we could have done this a whole lot more simply. If the cap was 2.5, we could have done it in probably 25 words. We didn't need 200 to do that. And so I think clearly it's a mistake that we need to address. You may also hear from retired teachers, because the Vermont Retired Educators Association is also talking about it. I'm aware of that. And these are folks who worked a long time, thought they were promised 50% of the CPI, and now are finding out their first checks with the reduced amount, if you will, the 2.5 as opposed to 3.8, went out January 31st. So they're, the state looks at the CPI last summer when they did that, and then it's prospectively into January, and that's so they just started receiving, I guess, their first retirement checks that are negatively affected.
Okay, so
that may be why you're hearing
this is coming from retired teachers.
Yes,
Probably 100% of them are the retired teachers.
right, because it affects them right now.
Right.
Current teachers are not yet
Right.
negatively affected, but will be at some point in the future.
So is there a line between the NEA and the Retired Teachers Association? I mean, do you represent the active teachers?
We represent the active teachers.
Okay, so
I don't represent, Vermont EA doesn't represent. We have about 1,500 retired teachers. So they would, in theory, get our mailing, but we're not bargaining on their behalf. We bargain on behalf of active teachers with their local school. We help them.
My final question.
This is why we're here. This is good. And then I do want to move on a little bit.
Pension funding. I only know it by kind of innuendo and what have you, but stability of the pension fund.
Well, we want it. We're concerned about it too. We want to make sure that it's here today as well as tomorrow.
Maybe it's not your,
I'm not sure what you mean by funding.
all I hear about is pension instability. If you have a position or an opinion or.
Well, the actuaries every year come up with a number. It's called the actuarially determined employer contribution, which is the state contribution in this context, ADEC. And the state for the last several years has been putting in exactly what the actuaries asked of the state to put in. So that's good. And the deal that was struck last year put in a little bit extra to make up for I don't know, it was 26 prior to the last 2 years ago, 2021, 26 out of the 30 years before 2008, maybe been 7 or 8. The state did not put in what the actuaries asked and requested. So there was a long period of time starting in the late 79, 80, where the state did shortchange or did not put in what the actuaries recommended. That does have you don't put in, all of your mortgage payment, if you will, think of it in that way, the principal is going to build up. And that's what happened. And so the state has been, since for more than a decade, I think it is now, putting in what the actuaries have asked for. That's great, but you still have to make up for some of the past, the sins of the past, if you will. And that's what last year's deal started us on an effort towards doing so. So that we think that's good. We want the plan to be on good financial footing, as I say, for today as well as for tomorrow.
Thank you. We may continue this conversation. I want to be respectful to the witnesses that have
Yes.
waited for about 10 minutes over. But this is very helpful and a great start. We might have the treasurer or somebody from his staff in to pull some of this apart, but I appreciate this.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks. Feel free to stick around. Yeah, in case Don has any questions. Ms. Vermont, please join us at the table.
Is that all right if I take pictures?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm realizing, so the executive director of the National Alliance of Mental Illness in Vermont asked you to join us today,
Correct.
which is terrific.
Yes.
So if you would be so kind as to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, what it was like to run for Miss Vermont, and then jump into your priorities. That would be great.
Yeah.
Even before we do so, let's just quickly go around the table. So you know who's here.
Hi, I'm Nader Hashim from Dummerston, representing Wyndham County.
Nice to meet you.
You too.
Hi, I'm Martine Larock-Ulick from Burlington, representing Chittenden Central.
Nice to meet you.
Brian Campion, Bennington County.
Dave Weeks, representing Rutland County from Proctor.
Awesome. Nice to meet you. And thank you so much for having me. So a little bit about myself. So my name's Alexina. I'm a business owner. I'm also Miss Vermont, and I'm a mental health advocate. I got involved with NAMI Vermont as a speaker, talking to students about mental health in high schools and middle schools. As someone who struggled with my own mental health, for me, it felt really important to come back to the state that I struggled, to be able to tell the story of my own lived experiences, as well as share resources and updated resources. Because as a teen, for so many years, I struggled in silence and in total denial of what I was going through, because I had never heard anyone openly share their own experiences. And we've come a long way about destigmatizing mental health, but we still have so much more to go. And I'm going to share a little bit about my experiences from visiting schools with NAMI, but also I started a nonprofit that focuses on interactive programs that I've taken all over the state of Vermont and talked to hundreds of students and parents about mental health and about how to take care of our minds, just like we do our bodies. The programs range from K through 12, so you get a range of students and different topics that I bring up to be able to hopefully slowly destigmatize mental health. And the more I enter schools, the more I realize how much more work there needs to be done. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those experiences as well as my own lived experiences to hopefully give you some insight into my findings and my own experiences. Awesome. So, I was born in Bennington, Vermont, and I spent all of my young adult life in Vermont. I studied interior architecture at Cornell University with a minor in health, hospitality, and design, which is a fancy word for where the intersections between hospitality and healthcare can see and kind of learn from one another. And I wrote my honors thesis on the study and design of behavioral health facilities. So you'll see mental health is something that has been kind of in my life on pretty much all points. And during the pandemic, I saw such a huge increase in mental health struggles within schools, within my own, as a graduate student. There was just so much more talk about struggling. And especially in our school systems, I think that's where the biggest focus is. And so I took a project that started in graduate school, and I took it a little too seriously and started a nonprofit around the Feel Better Way. So that's the nonprofit that I spoke about that offers support to Vermonter students struggling with mental health issues. So I created a book that is kind of an interactive program to be able to present to hundreds of students all over Vermont. So the book itself is written for like little me, of what I needed when I was younger, explaining what goes on in our brains and how can mental health affect me versus my friend next to me. How can I support my friends if they're struggling? How do I know if I'm struggling? All of these unanswered questions that I had that I wish someone had told me about. And I try to use a unique perspective of using illustrations to be able to showcase feelings and emotions in a way that doesn't feel either exclusionary or not seeing yourself, whether that's race, color, identity within pictures and ideations of people who are struggling. And so through this, I'd like to share what I've learned. So I'd like to start with an analogy. So about the current state of our students. So imagine you're in a beautiful park and there's a calm, tranquil lake that feeds into a raging river. At the end of that river, there's a steep waterfall and that crashes down onto jagged rocks. You see a kid struggling in the river, and so you jump in to try to save him. You successfully drag them back to safety, but you're emotionally and physically exhausted. You look back and then there's another student coming down the river in that same struggle. And so you are able to somehow jump back in the river, grab them, and you look to your right to the lake and you realize that there are hundreds of students in that lake charging for that same river to that same fall. And you realize you can't save them all. The waterfall is when a student is in mental health crisis situation. This is unfortunately where so much focus on mental health resources are centered. Mental health crisis increased for teens, girls by 50% in 2019 to 2021. And a teen takes their own life every 100 minutes. So these are just a few statistics that just kind of shine a light on how serious of a problem this is. And it really surrounds itself around students in high school, middle school, and college. There is undeniably a need for inpatient beds for teens. These are kind of emergency facilities, suicide prevention resources. However, this focus on crisis situations can mean teens who are struggling, those in the river, cannot get those resources until they are in crisis, tumbling onto the rocks at the bottom of the waterfall. So that was me struggling for years without any help. During middle school and high school, I became anxious and depressed after relentless bullying from being from a low-income single-parent home and struggling with a reading disability. I began to develop severe anxiety for not fitting in and not being included, and for struggling with my reading disability and being called stupid, being called the R word. I eventually began to self-isolate and I became depressed. From the outside though, I looked totally normal. I was a happy kid who was friendly, eager to make new friends, but okay if people excluded me. And maybe if I ignored all of those feelings for long enough, they would go away. But I noticed that because I wasn't falling off that waterfall, that I found it harder and harder to hide my interior mental state. And I found self-harm to be a new mechanism to cope. I would hurt myself from the outside so I didn't have to feel what was happening to me and the feelings that I didn't want on the inside. When I got into the school of my dreams at Cornell University, I hoped that a lot of things would change. I'm in a new area, new college with people who have no idea where I'm from. And I made friends really quickly, some of my best friends, and school was rigorous, but I was very successful. You'd think that my mental health would be better, or at least somewhat at ease. In the middle of freshman year, however, I started feeling those same feelings of self-doubt, anxiety, and stress. And again, through the outside, I looked fine. I called our school medical center and asked for mental health resources. And after an evaluation, I was told that I was coping really well and that the high volume of students that they had meant that I would not be considered. So I continued to try to paddle upstream. So many students in that same position struggled just the way I was, unable to make it back, unable to create coping mechanisms because they're so deep in and just trying to tread water. Most mental health offices are understaffed and overloaded, and so many students give up just like I did. After years later, I was so overwhelmed with feelings that I decided to give up and finally fall down the waterfall. I attempted to take my life and I woke up in the ER. I finally got help that day, but only after I completely hit rock bottom. So many people are turned away from not being severe enough, not being in crisis. I once was on a 9 months waiting list after losing my job in my healthcare, and I was told by more offices than one that if I wanted help sooner, I should go check myself into a psych ward, even though I was not suicidal. My experience, however, is not unique. I've spoken to dozens of students and parents who have been waiting on months for an appointment with a counselor, psychologist, psychiatrist, desperate to find help for their child. This is because all of the emphasis is on emergency care, but not for preventative care. Adding additional resources is absolutely necessary to help the students struggling in the river and in the waterfall. More inpatient beds, more emergency counselors, more school clinicians, and crisis helplines. But these take time and money to implement. And there are another possible avenue for assisting youth that could help them avoid the struggles on crisis downstream. Implementing social and emotional education and curricula to all students in the lake and normalizing mental health issues will improve students' mental health by identifying potential issues early and encouraging self-care. This could be implemented quickly by mental health awareness to existing health curriculum, like school health class, where we learn about sex ed, we learn about nutrition, but we don't learn about mental health. We don't learn about how to help ourselves and how to keep ourselves healthy and how to cope with the increase in stress that we all go through, but really suffers on our students especially. Designing an anchor point, which is having one adult for a student that they can kind of check in with and just have someone who knows that I'll be checked in on, or someone will ask if I'm okay. And if I'm not, I know that teacher is there for me, and checking in with youth on a regular basis. So in summary, I think the education sector has a huge opportunity to be able to increase the amount of talk about mental health, about depression, about anxiety at younger ages, and in the curriculum that is already there, to be able to help give students the tools so that they can help themselves, so that they know warning signs before they get ignored, before they are in crisis, and that's their last chance. Thank you.
Alexina, thank you isn't enough. This was incredibly powerful and helpful. And frankly, it's testimony like yours that legislators need to hear often. And it's a great reminder. And for you to share such personal experiences means a lot to me, and I know to everyone at this table. So thank you. And let's open it up to some questions.
You're the question guy.
I'm the question guy.
If you talk about pensions, it's one.
No, I deeply respect your personal sharing your personal situation. It's very, very powerful to the journey.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I would just say it fits in with a theme that we've all been hearing and experiencing for sure, especially, I mean, in health and welfare, yesterday's testimony.
Oh, yeah.
It's real and it's ubiquitous right now.
Alexina, you mentioned something that I've sort of forgotten about. We don't talk about them as much, and I don't know how much they're around. What is it? Helplines.
Mhm.
Is that, and this isn't really for you to answer, but I'm just asking myself, back in the 90s, there were all sorts of helplines, 80s, 90s. I remember my partner worked for one for LGBTQ people that, just want to call up, talk through their stories, that kind of thing. Do you know if the helpline is still out there in some?
Yeah, so
Okay.
there are mental health resources and helplines. There's kind of the crisis focus, which in the past year, 988 became the national mental health hotline that used to be the suicide prevention hotline, which was a number no one could remember. It was 888-43. I don't even know it.
Yeah.
And so they now, like 911, made it into a shorter number, and they saw a huge increase in calls of people calling, and especially students. I was at a presentation from one of those people who answers those phone lines, and they said that the number increase is dramatic. There are also resources like 741-741, which is a national, more of a, I feel not okay and I'm not really sure where to go. I'm not sure what resources are available to me. But one of the biggest things that I've heard from students about those helplines is one, misinformation. I heard from one student saying, and I guessed that this information was probably being inaccurately given to them by a parent, that you have to pay money to use those. All they want to do is get your information. Don't call them, and they're not helpful. They're not resourceful. So I've heard that from a good amount of students. I've also heard students who had no idea that there were such helplines. And there's also that's another kind of between a rock and a hard place, is parents being accepting of schools and of people bringing up those resources. There's this huge fear that if you bring up these resources, talk about suicide, that it will increase the number of suicides, and that is statistically incorrect. And it's an unfortunate place where some schools feel like, is it really our place to talk about this? If we send students home with resources like 988, are we making our students or our children think about suicide, think about mental health struggles? And that is far from the truth, but unfortunately something that I think keeps the education system behind in this fear of having parents disagree with the information they're given, even if that information is trying to save their kid's life.
Do you ever know if is a Vermont helpline? In other words, it's one thing to get somebody down in DC or out in California, but Vermont is its own unique issues, culture, and having somebody at the other line to understand that could be key. Do you know?
Yeah, so both of those helplines as well. There's the Trevor Project that has their own helpline for LGBTQ plus individuals who want to talk to someone who will understand their experiences and their stories. And all of those helplines, the ones I've mentioned in the Trevor Project, are organized so that they get distributed to the closest nearest sector. For example, state by state. So some student who calls in Vermont will get someone in Vermont. And I spoke to one of the suicide prevention hotline. I don't know what their caller or like answerer. And she said that she has never heard of a case where it wasn't reached. And if it was, it would get transferred to the nearest area. So New Hampshire, for example, or New York. So all of them are pretty standardized to be localized. But I mean, it's still, another thing with students that becomes really difficult is when they're not on their own parents' insurance. How do you get that help? How do you get those resources? Kids have spoken to me about not knowing if, oh, I don't think my mom I don't want my mom to know that I'm struggling, so I don't want to go to a healthcare facility that would be connected to my insurance. And that's why I think focusing so much more on preventative care and educational tools, and hotlines and helplines are great, but giving them real tools of how to deal with stress is way more important. And the stresses aren't going away. As someone who studied environmental psychology, there's so much research and dedication behind the reasoning we're seeing such increase in mental health. I mean, there's all sort of predictions, but one of the big focuses is that as we are developing in cavemen, all of those stressors were short, they were acute. The stressors now are long-term, political stressors of divisiveness between race and identity, paying bills, going to college, paying for college. All of these stressors are becoming lifelong. And that's why we're seeing, especially within students, such a high increase in mental health struggles, because there's and unfortunately, a lot of students, we tell students from a young age, put on a bright face, put your best foot forward, but we're never told, if you're struggling, reach out for help, or it's okay not to be okay. And that kind of language change within education, I think, would make it more and more acceptable for students to know who to go to if they're struggling, or know that it's okay to struggle and that it's normal. Normal is a charged word, but I use it because that's all I wanted to feel when I was younger. But if you ask a professional mental health, they say normal is a bad word, but
So I understand you're Miss Vermont 2022, right? Are you running again in 23?
I wish. They won't let me. They're kicking me out, but I will be continuing to do everything that I'm doing, just as me.
So I can tell you one way that you've already made a difference in this committee is next week we are hearing from physical educators and health teachers, and front and center for me, for sure, we'll be talking about that preventative care. What are the strategies that we are giving to kids, whether it's meditation, how to just accept all that kind of thing. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm sure I speak for all of us. If you do have ideas, if you want to continue to partner with us in any way, email those things to Hayden Ross. We would be more than happy to continue the conversation.
Absolutely.
You have our most sincere thanks for sharing, and we appreciate everything that you're doing in our schools, talking to kids, particularly since it's helpful that, sometimes an old guy going into school is one thing, but somebody who's young, somebody who's willing to share their experience, somebody that they can relate to day and night. So thank you very, very much.
You'll be surprised though. Sometimes they remind me that I'm not hip and I'm not with it when I use the wrong terms. But yes, I think that does make a big difference. Thank you so much for letting me talk. And I will be sure to I've tons of ideas and ways to be able to incorporate that into the school system. So I will make a presentation and send it over.
We would welcome that. And just so you know, our committee is live every day. When we do take up a topic, our agendas are always posted. If there's something, again, that you find compelling that you would like to weigh in on, please let us know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so
It means
much.
a lot. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for making the time. And Mother.
Yes,
Deborah, great, thank you. Yeah, thank you very, very much for joining us as well. Great.
Speaking of old guys,
Come on.
Well, you're in good company.
Yeah.
I also have to say, as a paraeducator, I was
Yeah.
interested in proceeding.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Yeah. Thank you. Mr. Kinney, thank you very much for joining us. This is a topic, mental health in schools, that we're looking for different ideas, different things we can do right now. And just to tee it up a little bit, when I met with local superintendents recently in my district, the message was, hey, right now, because of ESSER funds, we've been able to access, hire family engagement people, some mental health professionals. That's going to end, and that is a big concern, but also just finding people out in the community to do this work. So, and we also know from stories from across the state, across the country, we're at this crisis. So
absolutely.
Thank you.
So good afternoon. For the record, my name's Don Tinney, a high school English teacher from South Hero, currently serving as president of Vermont NEA. I too am here upon the request of NAMI Vermont. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today as you engage in important conversations about mental health. Having testified on school safety last week, then universal school meals yesterday, I can't help but note how the thread of mental health is woven into these two issues and woven into almost every other issues our students, families, and educators deal with every day. I respect and appreciate groups like NAMI Vermont and the Vermont Department of Mental Health, who have worked tirelessly to reduce the stigma previously associated with mental illness. Removing the stigma has allowed us to have real conversations about depression, suicide, PTSD, anxiety, substance abuse disorders, and other psychological conditions. Our educators, especially our school counselors and school nurses, must have time and resources to provide developmentally appropriate lessons for our children and youth, equipping them with the vocabulary and the comfort level that will allow them to engage in meaningful conversations about mental health, enabling them to seek the help they need and encourage their peers to find support. And I'd add that you just heard a perfect example of exactly that. I'm sure you've seen the 2022 State of Vermont's Children Report, recently published by Building Bright Futures. This comprehensive report details the many social and psychological issues facing our children and families today. While the report focuses on children from birth to age 8, the identified issues remain relevant for our students through grade 12 and beyond. Our schools are reflections of our communities, so we must remember that every societal challenge will, sooner or later, arrive in our classrooms. I will restate the concern you have heard in previous meetings. Our communities are in dire need of mental health care professionals. We need more school counselors, social workers, psychologists, school nurses, and behavior interventionists in our schools. The wait times for students to see a mental health clinician are unacceptable. The Vermont Department of Mental Health, the Department of Children and Families, and regional designated agencies are important partners to public education, and they need to be fully funded and fully staffed so they have the capacity to serve our students and their families. The lack of inpatient services for youth with severe needs has created extreme hardships for too many Vermont families. Years before the pandemic, educators were frustrated with how long their students had to wait to see a healthcare professional after they made the proper referrals. Not only are those wait times even longer today, but our educators themselves are finding obstacles to accessing the mental health care they need. Even as adult professionals with adequate health insurance, many find it difficult accessing health care because of its high costs, the frustration of dealing with third-party administrators and complicated insurance billing systems, and perhaps most importantly, the availability of providers. Given the nature and importance of their work, including the fact that they often absorb the secondary trauma of their students, educators need to have affordable and easier, if not immediate, access to mental health services. I understand the Agency of Education and the Department of Mental Health are working.
Senator Bullock, if you leave, we cannot continue. Do you mind waiting until maybe texting Senator Hashim?
Okay, yeah.
We just need to have a forum, please.
We're going to issue, and we applaud their efforts in supporting our educators. I've included links to the American Psychological Association that issued a report last spring explaining some of the issues our educators are facing. Knowing that our students were struggling with their own trauma before the pandemic, Vermont NEA received a grant from the National Education Association Center for Great Public Schools to sponsor our May 2019 Summit on Safe, Compassionate Learning Environments at the Burlington Hilton, where we brought together school board members, administrators, educators, and mental health clinicians for deep conversations about meeting the emotional needs of our students. At that time, students had identified anxiety and depression as their major concern for their peers, while educators were witnessing an increase in disrupted learning. Later that year, Vermont NEA joined our counterparts in New Hampshire, Maine, Rhode Island, and Connecticut to explore new possibilities in professional development for trauma-sensitive practices that supported the social and emotional well-being of our students. We worked with Dave Melnick of NFI Vermont to facilitate a series of webinars over the summer and fall of 2020. While we value professional development for our individual educators, we came to realize that our institutions must take a more systematic approach to supporting the social and emotional well-being of our students. Sending individual educators to a workshop and expecting a district-wide change will be disappointing. So we need to focus on the system and not only on individuals. As James Clear writes in Atomic Habits, you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your system. Knowing the importance of taking a district-wide, even a community-wide approach to improve our systems, Vermont NEA has formed a partnership with the Maine Education Association, NEA Rhode Island, and representatives from the association leaders representing school boards, superintendents, and principals to expand and strengthen labor management collaboration with a focus on mental health. As an aside, researchers at Rutgers University have found that strong labor management collaboration improves student achievement and increases educator retention by as much as 14%. While we're in the early stages, we are hopeful that this shared leadership approach will contribute to the continuous improvement of school climate and support for the mental health of our students. One example of this might be a team of educators and counselors evaluating the pre-K to 3 curriculum following the imposition of Common Core state standards and high stakes testing to decide whether or not we should return to a more play-based curriculum in which students can experience the pure joy of learning while developing healthy relationships. In closing, I would like to remind all of us that part of growing up is learning how to self-regulate one's behavior and emotional responses. For example, an occasional temper tantrum when we were 2 might have gotten us the attention we craved, but it is not an effective strategy later in life. As educators, we must teach our students how to self-regulate through what is now often referred to as social emotional learning. Many educators across the nation are having success with mindfulness training and yoga practices to support their students in learning how to self-regulate. I want to be clear that emotional dysregulation and subsequent disruptive behavior is not always a sign of a mental health condition, but often it is. So this is one clear example of why our schools need to be staffed with mental health professionals who can make those distinctions and provide the necessary services to students, their families, and educators. Thanks, and happy to answer that question.
Thank you. Committee questions. So we have a lot to do on this front. without a doubt.
Absolutely.
I know Mr. Fenn was in talking about one possible idea, which I think is a very good one, and you mentioned it also, increasing, of course, the mental health professionals in school, and easier said than done, because partly it's around training and making certain that people, are in the workforce to do that work.
There, I didn't
Yeah.
mention, we do have, as you're probably aware, we do have right now, I think, 5 community schools, pilot community schools.
Right.
And I think those show great promise. They certainly do across the other parts of the nation. And that's what some people refer to as wraparound services. And those services sort of built in. I think the important thing to remember is it's those designated agencies, Department of Health, and others who can cover it, because that's where the kids are. Right?
That's a great reminder. And for new committee members, this is a bill that came from the House last year, basically a pilot program. And we'll get an update on that, because I think possibilities of expanding that are huge and incredibly valuable.
So have they actually kicked off? Because, the
Yeah.
funding lags and.
Right, no, I think they started this year. I think this is the first academic year where the pilot's in place.
Do you know where they are?
I don't off the top of my head. I know the AOE oversees them. I think Jessica Carlos at AOE is the person who oversees
Okay.
that program.
Thank
Mr. Fenn, do you happen to know where they are?
I don't, Jing.
Yeah. I remember calling AOE this summer because or this fall, as some of the issues around behavior were popping up in Bennington, I was wondering if that district, if they had applied, and they said they did not apply. And that's the other tricky thing I want to get my head around is, some of these districts that are struggling the most don't have the personnel to write applications and
Right.
that sort of thing.
You've identified a very serious problem, and that the smaller districts simply don't have the personnel to write grants. Well,
Yeah.
larger districts have grant writers.
Yeah.
So I mean, it is unfair when we see programs that are grant dependent, that's going to be a hurdle for some. It's the same with small municipalities as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, committee, thank you all. We'll wrap it up tomorrow. Any final comments, questions?
I will send you a list.
Thank
Excuse me. The report from the AOE, there's a 4
That'd be great.
on community schools. Has them all.
Have a safe drive back if you're driving back.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.